Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our session on the future of learning, more specifically immersive learning. So I'm Martin Harper, Innovation Lead for Avenade in the UK and Ireland. So I'll be speaking for a little bit, but then I'll be handing over to our main speaker today, Dr. Benjamin Freud. So what is immersive learning? Immersive learning is high fidelity, highly interactive, highly immersive experience at scale. Verbal, visual, action-based. You could call this XR, or if we want to use its most recent terminology, Metaverse learning. So research shows that this type of technology can give people the ability to accelerate their learning by up to 70%. And the really interesting science that underpins this is that, neurologically speaking, when we interact with a screen, we're actually only engaging our frontal cortex. On the other hand, when we use something like virtual reality, we're engaging something called limbic resonance, which is a core part of how our brains generate memories. So many companies are already starting to look at immersive learning. There are some really good examples if you want to look them up at Exxon, Facebook, Walmart, and also our parent companies, Microsoft and Accenture. All of them are starting to make use of immersive learning. I think Accenture has actually even started rolling out VR headsets as part of their complete onboarding process for new joiners. So they're making use of thousands of headsets. And all of them are tending to see about a 10 to 15% increase in content recollection when using something like virtual reality. But why are we focusing on this today? Well, obviously, I think people realize that the pandemic has shifted the way we do things, with around 83% of workers now preferring kind of hybrid working models, especially if you're typically office-based. But furthermore, the Great Resignation has increased employees' expectations from the businesses they work for, especially when it comes to training, with around 94% of employees saying they might stay longer at a company if they really believe that company is invested in their learning. And also, in the US alone, we're estimating a shortfall of around 8.5 million skilled technical workers. And immersive learning throws up just one possibility of solving some of these issues. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Benjamin Freud, co-founder of Coconut Thinking, who's here to discuss with us the future of learning. So Ben, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the wonderful introduction and setting me up so well to move forward there. And I'd like to pick up on a point that you brought up immediately, and that's this idea of companies being invested in employees' learning. And I want us to remember this as we go through this short talk, because what I'd like to actually do is challenge it to take the title of this to the futures of learning and how they will impact your people. And the reason is that I'm going to propose that there isn't one future of learning, because everything becomes personal in the way we move forward in this immersive learning experiences. So I'll give you a quick background of who I am. I am currently in education. I'm the whole school director of teaching and learning at an international school in Thailand. I've lived in several different countries, taught in Saudi Arabia, and then been a school leader and a vice principal and a head of school. But I started my career in Silicon Valley in the late 90s. We were building Web 1.0. Yahoo had just gone public, and we were doing things that really nobody had ever done before, and people were trying to change the world. So I'm very, very much connected to this idea of where the horizon is for technology, for learning, for doing, for business, and so forth. And then I've got an academic background that may or may not detract from this conversation, but really what we're trying to look at here is learning in general. And I'm going to start by signposting that immersive learning, yes, has a huge technology piece to it, but the meaning comes from the inner side, and we're looking at the connection of the two, which is why companies investing in people means about knowing who they are. But I'll get to that in a second. I'm just signposting it right now. So the first thing about learning, and as someone who does this day in, day out, I think about it in terms of what we do with the learning. It's not enough to know things, it's what we do with the learning. Now, I'm not a scientist, but I do remember enough to know that if we think about the classes we go in, the content that we acquire as potential energy, it's when we do something with it that's transformed into kinetic energy. So I may know how to read or how to do accounting and fancy accounting tricks and do ledgers and balance sheets and so forth, but unless I do something with it, it's potential energy that's not transformed to kinetic energy. And businesses want to invest in their employees so that they act and transform that into kinetic energy. And that comes in various forms. And so learning also comes in various different levels of quality. Now, one's not better than the rest, but we have the rote learning and then the transformative change, or learning that leads to transformative change. Neither is better because they just depend on what it is. If you're learning to drive, that's generally rote learning. If we're teaching somebody Japanese because they're going to be transferred to Japan, the vocabulary, the grammar rules are rote learning, and that's really necessary. But to get to transformational learning, we need to have a different set of experiences. And this is where, in many cases, immersive learning as a technology experience, or an experience that we go through technology, comes into play. It certainly augments what we have. So I'm going to propose that there are two forces for transformative change, and I'm going to assume that everyone listening is interested in both the remote side as well as the transformative change, depending on what the objective is for the learner and for the organization and how they come together. I'm not going to necessarily go into the inner side, but I just want to say that it's there because I think be doing a disservice unless we brought that connection up. And so just like these trees, which underneath their roots are connected, the outer and the inner part of learning, of change, of those forces come together. And so really, and again, I'm preparing this to go further, there's inner forces and outer forces that work together. The experiences that we have outside interacting with technology come together with the inner forces. And those are like motivation, or how interested I am, or what I had for breakfast that day. It's a lot of things, but it's also about the values that we have and how we connect with company culture. So while we won't necessarily go into the part of inner forces, I just want to highlight that this is something to think about as we move down, and as your thinking might change over the next day, week, months, years. And so in this case, there's many outer forces, but we're going to focus on technology. And again, the inner forces could be meaning, and I want to get to that at the very end. So stick with me. I appreciate your patience on this. So here we go. This is a typical classroom, one of the first images that I got that was license-free. And for those who are in the States, this might not be too dissimilar from what you have seen and what you can't see, and probably what your children see in the States. And if it's not looking exactly like this, it'll probably look something like that no matter what country you're in. Now, I went online and looked for these pictures, and I specifically looked for a picture from 1922. And it looked like this. Not much difference except for the camera angle. We've got children in rows with their books open and listening. And most classrooms being with children or with adults will probably look like this or some form of this. Now, I know we're talking about hybrid models, but I still want to bring in the fact that conceptually, it is still the same idea of a lecturer delivering content, or some kind of software program delivering content, and then the learner receives it, maybe jots it down, maybe does a multiple choice quiz. Except unlike in 1922, we got phones, and it's really easy to get distracted by these phones, and it's really easy to know that our phones are ringing, that there's maybe more interesting content. There's a constant struggle for attention. And so the way that we worked before, the way that we learned when we were in school, don't work now. And they don't work for us as learners either, because how many get distracted? Oh, I'm going to check this on this window. I'm going to do other things. There's too much of a battle for attention due to these screens and due to the alternative content. Because one of the things that educators aren't talking about, at least not some are, but not as many, is that we have a wonderful thing that came out that all of us are using. And yet somehow, many of us, not all, live in a world where we don't really acknowledge the fact that learning has changed, because YouTube exists. And YouTube is the most effective way for us to find learning, find content, find ideas, find theories, find anything we want, whenever we want, about anything, and use it when we need it. If I don't know how to boil an egg, I go on YouTube. If I don't know how to work a software program, I go on YouTube. I can fast forward, I can rewind, I can stop, I can go back later. YouTube is everything that I could possibly need for learning. Now, YouTube is also two-dimensional, and it's also somebody telling you something, but because I choose it, I have more agency. And I can decide what I want to look at, and I can click off, go to the next one. Maybe it even refers me something. I am more in control. So while it's still two-dimensional and it's still somebody talking at me, I have that control that I can still work through that experience. But the reality is that even if we're talking about classrooms, even if we're talking about other ways, like, oh yes, but now we have hybrid, this is probably what's going on. We have someone here who's got a screen, maybe even you're interacting with them, but they have two other screens. If they're not laptops, there's going to be an iPad, there's going to be a phone. We have all mastered the ability to write text without anybody noticing that we're not looking into the camera. And so again, we're fighting for attention. And when the learner isn't in control of what they're learning, then it's really an uphill battle. Much like when we were in school, it was difficult to keep our attention. Now we have all these screens and we can do it pretty, maybe not openly, but certainly be able to do so without anybody knowing and just getting on with our business, because there's no one who's going to grab that phone from us because we're no longer in the classroom. So that's very important. And this is why the immersive learning piece comes in, because it's going to shatter all this. So again, when we're in control of the content and the experience, there's something there. But when we aren't and we're given something, it's very difficult. So even on the rote learning side, it's going to be difficult to get attention. And here is the one thing that COVID has taught us that all our children, well, I mean, all our children, many of our children are doing, that we need to think about, because now we are able to do this that we weren't able to do in a classroom. We can hit the mute button. If you're not interested, but you have to be somewhere, you just hit mute, and then you move on, and then no one's the wiser. And I've seen this in classrooms for adults and kids, and that's okay. But we need to know this. I mean, that we need to go through this, because if they're hitting mute, they're not getting the learning, and clearly the experience is not fulfilling, and then it's not meaningful. So where does this take us? This takes us to headsets. This takes us to immersive learning. This takes us to other things. In this case, this gentleman is in a sensory experience where he probably can hear, he can see what's going on, and now he is no longer distracted. So we've captured the learner, we've captured it, we've made it impossible, but I don't want to focus so much on the control aspect. I want to focus on the experience and what that changes, because that gets us beyond just thinking in the cognitive realm and gets us to a full-bodied experience. And so I've been showing a lot of pictures of nature, but this is what we were going to see. The experiences that we have walking around digital places, the experiences that we have sensing, feeling, intuiting, which is really going to deepen the learning, because we are part of this experience rather than receiving it. And this changes everything fundamentally from a learning point of view. If you are walking down the street and something happens, and unless you're on your phone, you are in that experience and it gives you meaning. If you are receiving something on TV, you might be doing something else. You're on a screen. So that's the difference. And yes, of course, this magical word metaverse that everybody's talking about, but nobody knows what it's going to be. I'm going to propose to you a vision of the metaverse that may or may not happen, but I'm pretty willing to bet that in a certain amount of years, could be a decade, could be two, will. And it's going to look like this. Instead of being in a classroom, we're going to be all geared out. We're going to have a headset. We're going to have some kind of spatial audio hearing component to our ears. We're going to have a sensory experience with these bodysuits. I wouldn't be surprised if eventually, in a few decades, we have neurotransmitters in our brains that allow us to taste and feel and smell in ways that we weren't able to before, because it connects directly in our brain. And so the question is, if our brains think that it's real, is it real or not? This takes us beyond like philosophy and consciousness and all these areas that I'm certainly not equipped to go into. But if our physical bodies are in one place, but our brains really believe because they have the sensory stimuli they're another, then it might be a reality. And so this changes everything for learning, because the experiences are happening. And so in this case, rather than walking through a forest, which I highly recommend, don't get me wrong, but if that is not possible, or if we're going through a certain learning experience, We can don on these bodysuits and walk through these areas, walk through these forests, walk through these natural places that maybe we'll be able to smell, touch, and feel. And so we can engineer a learning experience that is completely immersive, because we can control might be the wrong, but we can engineer the what is happening to the learner. We can make that happen. And that might be in a few years, but it will happen. And so now we're walking in a forest. Now we're walking in a desert. We're walking towards this futuristic city. Now this might be different from an office environment, but I deliberately put it in a natural place because this can be replicated and we can travel anywhere in the world by donning on a headset. We can talk to anyone in the world by donning on a headset and bodysuit. We can meet with anyone at any time, so long as we coordinate, time zones. We probably don't even need to speak the same language because the translator will do that for us. So this is a completely different experience. We are no longer bound by place. We're no longer bound by space, and maybe not by time. It is possible eventually in 10, 20 years that I could put on a headset and go visit Albert Einstein. And some kind of AI is going to have that experience for me. I could go off if I'm really interested in learning about, I don't know, whatever it might be, the Civil War, that I go have a conversation with Abraham Lincoln and interact with an AI. So this is a completely different set of everything that we've ever known before. And so in this case, imagine yourself walking through a city. Imagine yourself going to a conference with these headsets on in the metaverse, and you're able to interact with anyone at any time, and it feels real. It feels like a real human experience. That is completely different from the two-dimensional ones that we have now on Zoom. And that is what is going to be meaningful to everyone, because they are able to control what they do and have it be a sensory experience as well. And I'll get to why it's the futures of learning and not the future of learning. And these are avatars. These are people walking around the metaverse, and what we have is anybody can be anything they want. So we can move away maybe with the idea of bias. We can move away maybe with the idea of not being who we are. We can walk around this area. And so if we compare being on a laptop or being in a classroom, these experiences to donning on a bodysuit and visiting the world, then we are in a completely different learning paradigm. And so whether or not it's rote or transformative, and I imagine that most people listening would rather have a transformative experience, that learning that impacts the learner and then the business, then these immersive experiences are embodied, and they allow us to think, feel, and sense and intuit. And I promised I would get back to this idea of the inner side, and I'm going to go back and say meaning is different for each of us. And so the experiences that we have through the metaverse, through these immersive learning experiences, will be different for everyone. And if we're allowed to choose our own adventure, if the experiences that we have are different, just like our physical real life experiences are different, then the meaning that we have is different. And the meaning that we bring is different. And so this is something that I'd like to put maybe for a later conversation about how we can get the best out of learners by knowing who they are. So we give them experiences that are customizable to meet their learning needs. And so just to summarize and finish, this is really going to change everything, because it is no longer about content acquisition. It is about being fully embodied, immersive into an experience that transforms us and changes us, because we can engineer that experience to anything while giving the learner control of what they're doing and how they're moving. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Benjamin. That was fascinating. We've got some questions coming in from the audience, but first of all, I have one actually. So actually, I really like your point about headsets reducing someone's ability to get distracted. That's something I'd never considered before. But based on your teaching experience, what do you think still needs to happen from a technical or a design perspective to really improve the success, the uptake of these types of immersive learning applications?
So I'm going to try to unshare my screen so I have a little bit more. I hope that's all right. I don't want to go too bad, but it's just going to help me to focus. So what needs to happen? Well, there's always going to be a technology lag, and I think that some of the world that I've really allowed as a possibility, we're probably a good 10 years away from that easily. And so some of the experiences we have in the metaverse now don't necessarily represent what can happen. So there's always going to be a technology lag. From a technology point of view now, I don't know if there's much that we can do. However, if we understand where we're going, we can focus on this idea of inner meaning and really try to customize these experiences for what the learner wants. And so I would recommend that from a technology point of view, we spend a lot of time understanding the learner and finding out what it is that they can get out of these experiences to make it a little bit more choose your own adventure. That's critical. We could still meet these objectives. We could still have these transformative experiences, probably not as deep as they might be, will be later on, but spending more time knowing the needs of each person and working with that through algorithms now that are available in order to have those meet, then that would work out really well.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So just diving into the Q&A here at the side, what do you think are the implications of this type of technology for the workplace?
Well, I mean, the workplace means there's not going to be any more workplace. Simple as that. I can see the workplace being an area where we connect with our locality. So this brings up a whole new conversation about sustainability and about the inability. I mean, I don't think it will be possible in 10 years to travel as much as we did 5 years ago because of the carbon footprint. So this allows us to probably stay more local. It probably allows us not to go anywhere. We already have that with Zoom. But if we're able to have these immersive experiences where we don't necessarily, we're not behind a screen, we don't have Zoom fatigue, but we're able to be in a room with anyone at any time, and the room is completely interactive and our bodies, our minds think that it's real, then we're able to really stay local and still connect with people that we do in different ways. So the workspace will probably be a place where we connect more locally with our environment, but also with the people locally. It'll be stronger relationships with the humans because we're allowed to go into this infinite world where we can go to Mexico, Moscow, and Toronto within a second, much more so than we can with Zoom, which is still very much where we are now.
That's really interesting because something I've noticed recently is that we started going back into the office, mainly for kind of social things on like a Thursday, Friday, and I've been bumping into people who will say, oh, this is actually, I've been working with you for 2 years. This is actually the first time I've seen you face to face, not on a call. So it'd be interesting from a culture perspective to see if there's a future where people are saying, oh, I've only actually ever seen your avatar before. Or if it would be a blend of things like calls like this and kind of virtual reality type environments. Be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of potential to have deeper relationships locally, and not just with each other, but also with the environment, with nature, with our city, with our community. I think our brains might shift and our understanding of reality might shift because we now have really what is the power of teleportation. It's nothing less than that. We watch Star Trek, but we don't have to teleport physically if our brains can do it. And so now we have teleportation and mind and time travel. And I hope that allows us to have deeper connections with our community.
Exactly. So another one from the audience. In your experience as an educator, have you started to see these types of immersive learning practices having an impact already in classrooms?
Well, this is an issue because of resources. Most schools don't have this. In my previous school in Saudi Arabia, we did have VR headsets and we worked on this quite a bit and the kids loved it. And they weren't games. We had, for instance, I'm an educator who doesn't believe in dissecting animals, live ones. So we had an immersive experience where they explored the anatomy without dissecting, but explored the anatomy virtually. And so this was a powerful experience, because they were able to go into an animal and go on the insides and really see there without having to harm an animal or anything like that. So there's an ethical component to it too, but they loved it. They couldn't stop and they wanted to go back and back and back. There's something genuinely cool that gets people's imagination going about technology. We also have that about the natural world, but there's something about putting on a headset and seeing what's going to happen here. That is. I mean, it's really a part of the gamification. That's a whole other topic, but that's something that can be added that really motivates us. And there's so many studies about this that show that it takes learning to a different level.
Well, that's a fascinating example with animal dissection, and it's almost it makes me think of some stuff we've spoken, for example, to companies who work in like manufacturing, and they're looking at this for if you're training someone on a piece of equipment, not having to use or potentially damage or destroy an actual piece of equipment is a massive saving and a massive boost for how people learn at home. Yeah, I think it ties in nicely.
Absolutely.
So how do you think?
Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you. And this is where it gets really interesting, because you can alter that experience based on the level, and I use the word loosely, but on the level of experience of the learner. So some of them, I would have a much simpler task than you. And then as we go along, somebody can engineer that task or whatever happens to make it more and more complicated, to give you more and more challenge. Again, it's the gamification there. And that's something that you might not even realize is going on. But think of the power of that.
Yeah, it's so powerful. So just diving back into the chat, how do you think we should be preparing offices for this like new generation of workforce who are expecting this type of engagement in the workplace? We're going to have, eventually people will have this opportunity in schooling, and then they'll be going into higher education, then hopefully into like the workforce and companies. How can companies prepare for that type of learner that's coming through?
That's a very good question, and I think the biggest obstacle is that tech gap. And the tech gap, because there are expectations and there are realities, whether those realities are because the technology hasn't been yet invented, or whether it's because the company just doesn't have the resources or the right equipment, or because the learners' expectations are not realistic. So that's an issue. So I think one thing that can mitigate this, and this isn't something that comes with technology, this is just learning since time eternal, is really getting to know what that learner has and working with that every single time. Of preparing to get to know who they are, to give them meaning, to make them want to go, and trying to just being aware of that tech gap, just being aware, because you can buy all the stuff that you want. If you don't know how to use it and implement it, and more importantly, show that it has impact, there's no point. And so we can have all these programs, but it has no impact on the learner, then it's really a waste of money. So get to know who they are really deep and what is meaningful to them, and then complement that with the technology. That's going to be critical, and that's how we get ready now.
So actually, just on your point there about, you've mentioned it a couple of times around resources, effectively, to have this type of technology. And there's a great question in the chat here about effectively accessibility. So some people are raising concerns about if you move to things like VR, XR, there can be gender imbalances in how the technology is actually developed and tested based on one gender over another, or a poverty gap in terms of which types of schools can have this. How do you think we can reduce those kind of risks as we invest more in this technology?
If I had the answers to that, I'd probably be dialing in right now from the Cayman Islands or something. And who makes those the experiences? Who designs them? Because they're going to come with a bias there. If you have a team in San Mateo doing it, they're going to come with a bias from there. So even in the in the physical world, the world of reality, no one has created this other than nature. But if somebody's creating these experiences, then they will put in their bias. So the whole system is inherently biased, and that's something to be very conscious of. I don't know. How do we deal with the equipment? How do we deal with size? How do we deal with race, gender? The financial piece is probably the one that I'm most familiar with, simply because during the COVID crises, we had, everybody was online with maybe 2 mobile phones with a family of 6 in 2 rooms. And that really exposed the system. I don't know what the answer is to that, other than redistribution of wealth. And that's if it was that easy, then we would have done it already. So those are big questions that we're going to have to confront, I think, as a society. And I also think that we're going to being aware of them and bringing them up is the first step. But it's deeply troubling. Of course, with economies of scale, a lot of us have laptops. We didn't have that maybe 25 years ago. Back in the 80s when I grew up, having a computer was a big luxury. Now everybody has 5, be it on a cell phone or an iPad or whatever. So I don't have the answers to that, but we have to have those conversations, and we have to make sure that in the creation of those experiences, we bring in as many perspectives as possible.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And yeah, there's probably a governance element that probably goes beyond this session. But just kind of diving in again, you were talking earlier about ROI really matters on this. So are you seeing any good learning experiences or use cases in general for the metaverse that are being delivered now at a return on investment that actually makes sense?
I'm not, and that's because I don't have enough cases. It's all anecdotal, and I don't know if anybody is really doing this. And then it's of course the question of what is the metaverse. I've seen that people call the metaverse a 2D situation where you walk around and you go into different rooms, which is really cool. Whether or not that's the ultimate metaverse, I'm not sure. The ROI here is it could be very difficult to track. But again, we have to think about how do you even measure that, and that's the impact on learning. And we have to get right what what impact we want and how we measure that, and then connect that to finances. I think it's going to be a longer term experience, but we have to understand how do we measure impact of learning in the first place? Because oftentimes some of these courses, you tick a few boxes, you get your little certificate, and then you move on, but it's not always followed through what the impact of that learning is. And I don't think it would be honest, I'm going to use that word, to talk about ROI, about technology, without looking at what the real impact on the learning is, and that is that transformation. How do you measure transformation? Is measuring transformation even the right word? Is it a qualitative experience? Do we have to look at it in terms of numbers, or are we looking at maybe how culture might change? Again, if we're talking about deeper relationships locally, or the ability to teleport, how do we do that on ROI? What if it's job satisfaction? It's so complex that we need to be very careful, and I really wouldn't want to just keep it at ROI at a quantitative level. We have to come to an agreement about what the qualitative side is.
I take your point. It's probably a very difficult thing to measure at this stage, but it brings me on to another question, which is: are there any other like emerging learning trends that you're excited about, separate from immersive? So I know there's, they're probably in the news quite a lot recently. There's things like micro learning on applications like TikTok, LinkedIn certificates, study rooms on chat rooms, for example. Are there any of those that you think are particularly exciting?
Well, it's a good question, and I was thinking about MOOCs, these massive online, I don't know, the courses that they have, and you could pick whatever you want. You go to edX, you go to Coursera, you pick whatever you want, and you get some university course, and it's great because you can choose and you can fast forward, but ultimately you're still being delivered content. And I think that's one of the big reasons MOOCs haven't had the impact that people were planning, is because you're still receiving that. I think it's the same thing with LinkedIn. It's the same thing with everything where you are given something. It's even faster now to just fast forward or not listen or walk away. And I think that the assessments that are given on a lot of these are so incredibly simple that they really don't test anything. I've taken MOOCs before and learned quite a bit, but the assessments have been, summarize what it is. So again, we're lacking impact on what that is of the learning. But I'm excited about this idea of these experiences going out, experiences connecting, experiences thinking about what our values are. Because to me, the learning is deeper when we know who we are. And I think there's a lot of movements out there, a lot of conversations about going back to who we are. And that doesn't necessarily go towards technology, but technology can help with that because it facilitates conversations. I am so excited now that over the last 2.5 years, it has become normal to text message a stranger and call someone up and say, hey, saw what you wrote, let's have a Zoom, and you can do that. And you weren't able to do that before. You simply weren't able to do that, but now it's normal. So that's what I'm excited about, these connections that we have.
That's a really interesting point you make on the behavior changing side of this type of technology. And there's a question in the chat about this. Do you think that the use of avatars, anonymity can impact human behavior in these types of spaces that we're inevitably going to be building?
Yeah, I do, and this is something I'm really interested in. There's people who have studied this more than I, but if we're talking about bias, prejudice, and all these things, being able to design your own avatar and come in with who you see yourself as breaks gender, racial, physical, all these kinds. I can be a purple dinosaur if I want to. Maybe not purple. Maybe that's the wrong choice of color, but you know what I mean. Or I can be a man. I can be a woman. I can have long hair. I can be who I am and represent myself. Change based on my mood. I think that really shifts our relationships. If I see you as who, because you're designing who you see yourself and how you want people to see you, that's a narrative that's very powerful.
But do you think then, and this again just ties into another question in the chat, if we're increasingly going to be engaging with each other in these types of virtual online spaces, do you think there's a risk that how we interact in the real world then kind of lags behind almost and changes quite dramatically?
It could be, that's a risk. I think people were also afraid of the telephone and television, and I'm not trying to belittle this comment because it's absolutely on point. I think that I think, and this might be good or bad. Actually, there's no such thing as good or bad, so it is what it is. But rather than looking at it from a dystopian point of view, I welcome the possibilities that this offers of connecting more to our local context, particularly in a time when we have to watch our carbon footprint. And I think that it allows us to connect more locally while also opening channels of who we want to be more elsewhere. So if I think about it, 10, 15 years ago, we were pretty much constrained, our circle of friends, to who's around us. But now we're able to have, an enormous pool of friends and collaborators and contributors. So the opportunities there are, I've got my friends on LinkedIn and on Zoom, and I talk to them, and they're all over the world. If I didn't have that, not that I don't love the people around me, but it's just not as rich. So there is a risk for dystopia, absolutely. But there's also a risk for liberation. There's also a risk for having higher quality relationships based on interest, based on common goals. And that's something that I don't think we should discount.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I think we do tend to, anytime there's new technology, you instantly catastrophize rather than kind of leap to the benefit of the doubt. But it'll be an interesting thing to try and balance out. Okay, so just diving back into the questions. This is a really good one. How do you think we can get over the current bias that online learning is less valuable than in-person education? And I don't know if this question ties into, I know there's differences people think between, online distance learning courses compared to going to like a physical university. But do you think this is a way to overcome that kind of bias? Do you think that will change?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question, please?
How do you think we can get over the bias that online learning is less valuable than in-person education?
Choice, ability to go with whomever we want. We're limited physical to the people who are in the room. Online, at least we can pick and choose people that we have connections with. I might have similar interests, someone in Tokyo, Madrid, and down the road, and we can meet together in this space. So the quality is different, but that doesn't mean that it's better or worse. It's just different. I have made, and we all have made, tremendous connections with people all across the world. And there's nothing to, being able to fast forward, stop, and rewind is very, very, very powerful. Having closed captions is very, very, very powerful. So it's just a different kind of experience that's delivered. And I think the bias is probably due to the poor quality of content rather than the actual mode through which it's delivered. I'm just gonna move this real quick. I'm sorry about that. I think I'm just gonna run out of juice real quick. So I'm just gonna move this over here because apparently my plug doesn't work very well. And I'm sorry about that. But this is another thing about online learning, right? This is the wonderful thing, is that we have learned to accept these idiosyncrasies and weird things that happen, like Zoom not working or people needing to plug in their computers. And we've become more patient and we've become more understanding and empathetic because we've all gone through these. So that's another benefit.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I think there's many people who'd argue that with other parts of the tech spectrum, especially the social kind of aspect of it, the people are losing their patience more, but maybe it's just the patience is transferring from different platforms. Because I take your point that I think everyone is now, even 2.5 years into everyone being on online calls, everyone still a couple of times a week is going to be on mute when they're trying to speak, but people are just getting past it.
And when we started this call, there was a little bit of time to get everything sorted out, technically, and nobody got impatient with me. Everybody was very cool because we're all used to it. And that, I think, there's a certain amount of empathy. So again, there's a benefit to that.
There's a great question here that I think is almost more conceptual. So it's before the internet, we had to learn information, I guess, from physical sources. After the internet, we're having to sort through all the information that's available. What do you think is going to happen when we're into this kind of immersive experience learning? Do you think there's another shift?
Oh, what a great question. And that is as an educator, been on my mind a huge amount. Yeah, before it was about how much you could remember. To be a lawyer, to be a whatever it might be, to be a doctor to a certain extent, although you need some skill, but it was how much you can remember. Now you don't need any of that. Now, rather than information scarcity, we have information overload, and the skills that we have are, how do I find the highest quality information that I need to have impact in the least amount of time? Because there's too much information. So that changes everything from K to 12, although K to 12 is very slow in realizing this. I think it's going to shift the workplace tremendously, this ability to sift through information. And now when we are not limited by time or space through the metaverse, it's going to be augmented. It's going to be even greater. So I could really see that there's going to be some kind of, maybe the word crowdsourcing isn't the right word. Maybe it's not about curation. But somehow networks are going to have to work together to curate, to find, to identify the best information possible, so that we are no longer required to sift through that information. We work together, and we work on these repositories. We work on some kind of platforms of information distribution network where we help each other out. And it could be as simple as me visiting a virtual library in London, and then picking up a book and sending it to you somehow electronically. It could be that we go back to a world that is in some way just more collaborative and paradoxically more simple, because we're working together and we don't have to do it alone. So yeah, I think that is the big issue. How do we deal with information? And of course, this opens up a whole door of social media and fake news and disinformation and that. Insert conversation here about that, but that's the biggest challenge I think we'll face probably this century.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating point of conversation, that, and it ties in just kind of slightly to another question that's come in. I know at the start of the presentation you showed this sort of image of classrooms that haven't really kind of changed that much, and I know that if you go into a platform like AltSpace to do a presentation, oftentimes it still looks like an auditorium. People are using what already exists today to influence how you build immersive worlds. But do you think that, or how do you think things like delivering a lecture will change in 10, 20 years? Is it still going to be that virtual auditorium, or is it going to be taking someone along like a video game quest?
So I think it's going to be even more than that. I think AI will know us so well that when we start off those headsets, we might have the same learning objective that's connected to who we are, but what's going to be different is the experiences that we feel. So let's imagine that we are going through some kind of, some kind of training, and the AI will know who we are and customize those experiences to make it even more powerful. That's why I was talking about meaning and trying to get to know who we are. So it will happen so that the computer will see when I'm interested, when I'm not interested, based on my eye movements, based on my pulse, based on my temperature. And then it will shift the content in such a way as to maximize my interest and my engagement. So this is something we didn't talk about because it goes into the world of sci-fi, but then again, so is this whole conversation, but I think it's quite relevant. The AI will customize it so that we have the same learning objectives, but different experiences. So that means that, how does a lecture happen? I don't think a lecture will happen. I think we will be in these experiences right now, going through it, and the AI will change everything based on how we react because they will know us so well. History, I'm a historian by background. There will be no more lectures on history because what we'll do is we're going to don on a suit and then I'll be in the trenches in World War I. Simple as that. I will be walking around the plains of Oklahoma, as a settler. That's going to be it. And anything that has to do with more, say, difficult mathematical concepts, it'll be a collaborative experience like a conversation, because no one is going to sit through a lecture when they can turn someone off and go find something else on YouTube that is curated with graphics, moves faster, and done much more professionally. Why? And I ask this to myself all the time. Kids are asking now, why should I listen to you when I can go on YouTube and have real footage, real graphics, real everything? Lectures will be completely passe unless it's, it'll be more more out of the norm than it is today.
I love that vision that you're painting, because I've seen it. I know it's not even that far away from what I've seen. Is that I think it is at Khan Academy. I think they use an AI through webcams to track if a student is getting basically too bored on a certain topic and can suggest different learning paths for it, which is fantastic. But it brings me to a very kind of practical question that's come up. How do you think assessment and credentials might change in this type of immersive learning environment?
Again, that's a very good question, and that's something that the world of credentials hasn't come together just yet, because there has to be, credentials are going to be like money. It has to be accepted. Dollars are accepted, but Saudi riyals are not. And so we're going to have a conversation about what that looks like, and what companies, whether they do their own credentialing, but how does that transfer, whether or not there's a uniform area. Of course, there's a lot of talk about blockchain and being able to maybe point to experiences that are documented and say this is the credential, but always having behind the curtain on blockchain proof and evidence of what has been demonstrated. I think that working in these experiences rather than having a test, it'll probably be a lot more, I don't want to say task oriented, but certainly something that is required to be produced and creative. So we talked earlier about being in manufacturing, having a digital record of being able to fix that, fix that motor is something that can be kept on blockchain. And then that might be able to get us over this idea of faith and trust in a credential, because then it's backed by something, right? Like the dollar used to be backed by gold. This will be backed by what's on blockchain. Because if they keep, if creativity in this uncertain world is really what we're looking for, then we have to have evidence of creativity, and that can't be standardized. And that's really important. It can't be standardized. So right now, when we go on these MOOCs or we go on these platforms, it's all this, multiple choice questions. Like, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't show really any example of creativity. But give a problem, have someone solve it. Maybe produce a masterpiece like it used to be done in the Middle Ages, right? Maybe it's going to be something like that, because then it allows full creativity with standards of quality, which are different from standards of achievement. And then it's backed by blockchain. Then we're able to investigate and say, oh, this looks really good. With maybe credentials as signposts rather than ultimate value. I can't see there being ultimate value in a credential without it being backed up by some documented evidence.
So you mentioned blockchain quite a lot there, and there's a question here that ties into this. They say, I love your points about AI, but could you go into more detail about how other forms of emerging technology will impact learning, e.g. blockchain, IoT, 3D printing, etc.?
Yeah, 3D printing is already quite prevalent, which is fantastic. And there's certainly, we can do now whatever we want with 3D printing. I think there's going to have to be a conversation around sustainability there. But that's something that allows us to create things and allows our imagination to I mean, again, it's magic. We can make things now out of nothing. It's amazing. Just do a program. It's something out of Sorcerer's Apprentice. And blockchain will be a way, I think, of documenting. It'll be a way of evidencing, because how many of us have seen curriculum vitae that weren't always 100% accurate, but now we can demonstrate that with real evidence that's of course on blockchain in itself. Credentials are kept, or maybe there's a certification process, and we can access those experiences that might be recorded, for instance, which allows us insight into people's thinking, how they've made decisions, maybe ethical dilemmas. It's one thing to go on an interview. It's another thing to watch the record of how someone navigated through an ethical dilemma or a team building exercise or something like that. Again, there's in itself ethical issues around that, but I'm leaving that for a different conversation. Internet of Things, I don't know. That's something that people have been talking about. There's a lot of money in there. Whether or not it works, I just don't know if that's coming up, like what that's going to look like, what that's going to emerge. I don't know if that's, I just don't know. If we talk about the fourth industrial revolution with being able to connect our bodies to these technologies, that might be much more relevant than the Internet of Things. And that goes back again to creating sensory experiences, which is ultimately, I think, the basis of anything that changes us is these sensory experiences that we might have that alters our reality and makes us physically better, right? Because now, if you know, I had surgery on my eye for cataract, great, but I thought, what if I could get a bionic eye? That'd be pretty cool. Again, there's ethical issues there. But I think that's something to keep on the horizon of physically changing our bodies in order to get places. But that's, again, that maybe I'm digressing, but I think it just goes to show that the possibilities are just limited by our imagination at this stage.
Yeah. God, a world where blockchain prevents anyone from spinning their CV. I fear for anyone who works in consulting. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So as a point here that is more around, I think, kind of the governance side of this type of experience. You painted a really fantastic picture earlier of, you know, history students being able to go into the trenches in World War One. The member of the audience is raising the question that this is probably going to be very expensive to develop, which means we might have to rely on more and more kind of big businesses to sponsor these types of experiences. So how do we make sure education remains neutral rather than being overly influenced by big businesses?
And that is the big question with the metaverse. Will it be owned by 3 companies or will it be completely open source? And there's a battle right now about this. There are tremendous battles right now. I like everyone worried that it's going to be owned by three companies, and then they control another. I would suspect, and this is where I might cross over in the line of being naive. I would suspect that if it is owned by 3 companies, it's not sustainable because people will reject that. I will suspect that people right now, because of the issues that we have, with the environment, I keep bringing this up, but I think it's tied, with the environment, with the fact that we have to make different choices in the way we consume. I think there will be a backlash against these big companies. And I think people will be forced to think about the decisions that we make and who influences us in these decisions. And that will be a barrier against the monopoly or the oligopoly of some of these learning experiences, and that it will naturally go open source. Again, I might be naive, but we're at a crossroads as a species, as a planet, and I think that the same ways of thinking will go into the metaverse. It will be a tool of liberation rather than of, the opposite.
But I mean, you raise a really good point there around effectively protecting people's kind of rights in these types of spaces. There's a question in the chat here that ties into it, which is kind of, given there are so many, engagement measures, especially with, headsets and sensors now, so blood pressure, pulse, eye gaze, data which will be kind of essential for the benefit of that personal user experience. But how do we think this stuff is going to end up being protected? Is it going to have to be a government level instigation of that kind of initiative? Is there going to be stuff around just personal data protection? What do you think?
I hope so. I think that it will have to happen. I mean, I've got an Apple Watch. I use LinkedIn. I'm on my, I use Google. I mean, people are already buying into other folks owning data. We could talk about the same thing with plants. I mean, the fact that they could put intellectual property on plants is we're already as a society accepting that you can own another life's forms, what makes them, their DNA, their behaviors. So that's something that legally already exists. So again, it's part of a bigger system of, can we own somebody, another life form's DNA? And it goes to the plant world. There will have to be government regulations. That's clear. I know now, ever since 2 years now, they ask you if you accept cookies every time you go on a website. to accept because it's just a lot easier. But I suspect that there will be, again, a backlash. I really do feel, and again, I could be naive, I really do think that the way we consume anything will have to change, and the way we allow others to consume will have to change. But the way we consume is like how we interact with technology. I do think it's going to have to be government regulation, because if you leave it to the companies, they're just going to take it all, and probably more.
Yeah.
And just one more thing, if this ethical question doesn't get resolved, then we will tip over into dystopia, no question.
That's yeah, I mean, that kind of honesty is very much appreciated, I think, by everyone on the call. I think we're going to have just kind of one final question here, and it's more about kind of workplaces. I think everyone on this call will be from different types of companies. Some will be moving faster, some will be adopting slower. But how do you recommend that digital leaders start thinking about the future of learning? What are some steps they can do now to start preparing?
And this is a question that goes across. So all learning experiences are the same in the sense that learning is about, we go through an experience and then we are altered on the other side. I think here it's very important to think about, not in terms of models, but in terms of context, in terms of where we are physically, in terms of where we are financially, what the role of our business is, the vision, the culture. I don't think we have to get away from like, we need to do it this way, and really think about, again, this inner work, these inner forces of what the culture needs at this stage and what it can do. So that anybody who's a leader of innovation, of digital change, whatever it might be, has to think about the local context and what's right for that, rather than depending on models that may or may not be applicable. And as soon as we switch from that, and as soon as we stop using words like best practice, because there is no best practice, there's practice that worked in one context and might not work in another, then we're again allowing ourselves to be more free to make the decisions that we want for what's right for our community. By the community, I mean, our office, our company, our city. And so being able to really look inside at what we need and what we're trying to do and what we can do, and moving forward this way is going to be critical, rather than do some kind of arms race, which may or may not be beneficial, and especially not beneficial if you're trying to replicate what the company, 10,000 miles away did.
Super. So I think we're going to wrap up here, but just I think from myself and all the audience, thank you so much, Ben, for your presentation, and two, for taking everyone's questions and my own. I thought that was utterly fascinating, and as someone who works kind of in this space, absolutely invaluable, both on the kind of the practical elements of preparing for this change, but also for the conceptual dilemmas that it throws up. I think it's really valuable to discuss. So thank you everyone who has tuned in for this. I believe the recording and the slides are going to be made available, and you'll be notified about that. But again, thank you very much, Ben. I think everyone's very appreciative of your time. And we're going to wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.